The central problem of the Civil War is simply stated. It's a problem of leadership. Generals such as Essex and Manchester were constantly applying the brakes. They were avoiding battle, failing to take the offensive, even when they had a crushing superiority, as was the case at Newbury, where they snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. This, of course, frittered away the success at Marsden Moor to some extent, and the Royalists drew a new encouragement from a number of successes which they succeeded in gaining. For example, in Scotland, where the Marquis of Montrose stirred up a revolt of the Highland clans on behalf of Charles, and he proved to be quite a formidable, quite a skillful leader of guerrilla war. At one stage, they even succeeded in capturing Glasgow, and they were a thorn in the sides of the Covenanters and of the Parliament for several years. So this situation clearly stoked up a move of tremendous discontent, particularly in the ranks of the army, where now for the first time we can say that the leveller influence was growing rapidly. And it found an echo even in the ranks of the officers who in Parliament expressed their discontent with the situation. And it was quite intolerable. And therefore, the only possible solution, this was clear to everybody, clear above all to Cromwell, that the only solution was to get rid of the existing military leadership. And this was achieved through a device known as the Selfdenying ordinance. This is the way in which Cromwell, if you like, cut the Gordian knot, to use that expression. The self-denying ordinance was a bill that was put before Parliament, which stipulated that no member of Parliament, either the House of Lords or the House of Commons, could hold any leading post, any commanding post in the army or the navy. Now, this was clearly aimed at Essex and Manchester. It was clearly aimed at the Lords, and the Lords therefore predictably put up ferocious resistance. But in the end, they couldn't win the day. They couldn't succeed. The situation was too obvious. And finally, on the 3rd of April, 1645, the ordinance was approved by both Houses of Parliament. Now, this represents a decisive change in the whole situation. It was, in effect, a coup d'etat, if you like, by Cromwell, a bloodless coup, in which he succeeded overnight in getting rid of Essex and Manchester. They were removed from the picture. Sir Thomas Fairfax was placed in overall command, but in reality, the real moving force behind the new army, which was now being raised, was Oliver Cromwell. And here we enter the reign of the new model army. Now, this is an important development. This was an entirely new army, which was established. New volunteers were raised. For the first time, the British Army was made up of full-time professional soldiers rather than part-time volunteers tied to the local garrison. Yes, but this was, that's not the end of the story. Too often military historians emphasize the technical side, the discipline. Of course, there was discipline. We'll deal with that in a moment. That's all true. But the main and fundamental difference between this army and all other armies that have ever existed in history, this is something entirely new on the face of the earth, was first of all its social composition. Cromwell recruited his soldiers from all social classes, but especially from the lower classes, from the people we refer to as the men with no shirts. Or to be more accurate, it was not the lowest of the low, the poorest elements. It wasn't that. It was mainly the artisans, the tinkers, the tailors, the cobblers, the carpenters, people of that description in the main. Cromwell actually said, he warned when he was raising his troops, and he spent a personal fortune out of his own pocket in paying for this. Be careful, he wrote, what captains of horse you choose. Of horse, by the way, he was very keen on developing the cavalry for reasons which we've discussed. Be careful what captains of horse you choose, what men be mounted. A few honest men are better than numbers. Quality, not quantity. If you choose godly, honest men to be captains of horse, honest men will follow them. And that applied to the officers. Some of the officers were from lower classes. One called Ewa had been a serving man, a servant. Oakley had been a drayman. And the outstanding Levelly, I think one of the most outstanding, if not the most outstanding revolutionary leaders, not sufficiently well known, I think, in comparison to Lilburne, but I think better than Lilburne, in a way, was Thomas Rainsborough, whose father had been a captain, actually a famous captain. He was a national hero as a result of his exploits in the wars with Spain, I think. People like that, and these really were the cream of military officers, like as in the Russian Red Army, I would say, or the French Revolutionary Army, if it comes to that. People like Tukhachevsky in the Red Army. These were top-notch revolutionary officers, and therefore the majority of these troops, of course, being drawn from the lower classes, they were inspired by. They were overwhelmingly. Certainly all Protestants, overwhelmingly Protestants, and many of them were what you might call religious extremists, religious radicals. That especially applied to the cavalry, which was overwhelmingly radical and Puritan in its composition. And this, of course, caused a lot of controversy. People attacked the new, from the very beginning, they attacked Cromwell's army, saying that it was made up of all kinds of low-class people, low people, and so on and so forth. Cromwell rejected these criticisms out of hand. Bear in mind that Cromwell himself was not a poor man. He was from quite a wealthy farming background. He rejected it out of hand. I quote, he said to his critics, "It provokes your spirit to see such plain men made captains of horse. It had been well that men of honour and birth had entered into their employments, but why do they not appear? But seeing it is necessary that work must go on, better plain men than none, and best to have men patient of once, faithful and conscientious in their employment, and which I hope they will approve themselves." Denzil Hollis, who, as you remember, had been in the past a leading parliamentary figure in the parliamentary opposition, now passes with arms and baggage over to the camp of conservative reaction, of Presbyterian counter-revolution. He made a sneering comment about the new model and its officers. All of them, he sneered, all of them, from the general, that's Cromwell, to the meanest sentinel, are not able to make 1,000 a year. Just imagine people like that, not able to earn £1,000 a year. Most of the colonels, he said, are tradesmen. Imagine that, tradesmen. Brewers, tailors, goldsmiths, shoemakers, and the like. This is the insults, the class insults, the class snobbery from Denzil Hollis, to which Cromwell famously replied, "I'd rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows than what you call a gentleman and is nothing else. I honour a gentleman that is so indeed." And this is the language of class war, by the way. This is a class question. And here already one sees the glimpse of an approaching social revolution. An interesting little anecdote that when the Presbyterian minister, Richard Baxter, he wrote quite a lot about this period. When Richard Baxter visited Cromwell's army after Marston Moor, he was horrified with what he saw, absolutely horrified. He complained bitterly about the bad behavior of the soldiers and their loose habits and their ribald language and so on. By this, by the way, he didn't mean that they were swearing and cursing, because that wasn't allowed. That was strictly, like drunkenness, was strictly prohibited in the ranks of this disciplined revolutionary army. What he meant by their bad language is the fact that they're constantly debating, these religious radicals in the army were constantly debating religious matters, and they were speaking in quite familiar terms about Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit and the Bible and so on. Something which, of course, ordinary people, tinkers, tailors, and cobblers shouldn't be discussing these questions at all. That's something that only educated people, proper people like Baxter himself, were supposed to do. And of course, when I said earlier, perhaps I think some eyebrows might have been raised when I said that the Cromwell's new model army was a mixture, was like a mixture. I think it's a fair comment. Was like a combination of the Russian Red Army, the Soviets, and the Bolshevik Party. Oh yes, I meant it. And they were constant. It was a democratic army. There were constant debates taking place in the rank and file all the time. And of course, this spectacle of a revolutionary army, that's what it was then, clearly. A very effective revolutionary army, furthermore. It put the fear of God into the wealthy property owners who made up the bulk of the House of Commons, and not to speak of the House of Lords, and of course their Scottish Presbyterian allies. And these men were anxious to put an end to what they thought was a dangerous revolution in church and state that was represented by the new model. They were particularly suspicious of Cromwell and his army, full, as they would see it correctly, full of religious radicals, levelers, and revolutionaries. Quite right, so it was. And you see, what was it that they were so frightened of? Well, think about it. Let's go back to what I said, a combination of the Soviets, the Bolshevik Party, and the Russian Red Army. Yes, precisely. What terrified them is that here was a force, an organized, disciplined, centralized force that gave an organized and conscious and disciplined expression to the somewhat incoherent revolutionary strivings of the masses. Oh, yes. And think about it. Just think, use your imagination for a moment. In those days, there were no such thing. There was no such thing as a political party. Either left, right, or centre did not exist. Unknown, never been seen in history. Here was an organization that provided the necessary vehicle, organized vehicle for the revolution to succeed. And this was a terrifying prospect, particularly when this vehicle was armed to the teeth with very courageous fighters. Now, therefore, what I'm saying is that the new model army, therefore, played an essential role in organizing, mobilizing, motivating, and centralizing the revolutionary masses, no doubt about it. And therefore, this is where the English Revolution is somewhat different. I think that's what puzzles people, you know. English Revolution is somewhat different with the French Revolution or certainly the Russian Revolution. It's the central role of the army. The army is the centralizing force, the organized force of the English Revolution, and will remain so from start to finish. And by the way, this religious extremism of the army made them into formidable fighters that were prepared to fight and die. They weren't afraid of dying. That was their decisive advantage over the enemy. Courageous, disciplined men of iron. Prince Rupert once, I think he meant it as an insult. He described them as the Ironsides because I think they wore some body armor, you know. And this epithet stuck. And by the way, it's a very appropriate epithet, which was later born as a badge of honor. The Ironsides, oh yes. And though they looked upon these weavers and cobblers and carpenters in arms, they looked upon them, first of all, with a kind of snooty attitude of superiority. You know? They soon found out to respect, they soon learned to respect Oliver Cromwell's Ironsides, which proved they had proved it already in the Battle of Marston Moor. But you see, this very military efficiency precisely is what put the fear of God into the Presbyterian moderates in Parliament. They needed Cromwell's army, they needed to fight against the king. Yes, but as soon as possible, as we shall see, they intended to stab it in the back, to get rid of it as soon as possible. And therefore, that's the main reason for it. You see that the red thread that runs through everything that I've said, this fear of the masses, fear of revolution on the part of the property classes. That's the point. And that is the reason why the Parliament, precisely at this moment, decides to press for more negotiations with the king, peace negotiations and so on. which commenced at Uxbridge and dragged on through the winter without leading to any conclusion, because the king wasn't budging from his demands. Finally, predictably, the negotiations were abruptly broken off by the king in the spring of 1645, and Charles opened a new military campaign by a march to the north, beginning with a fresh offensive in the Midlands. And here's where our attention must be centered, and here's where the most decisive battle of the First Civil War, because there were two civil wars, actually, as we shall see. But the most decisive battle of the First Civil War took place here. On the 30th of May, parliamentary forces was laying siege to the king's capital in Oxford. And in an attempt to divert attention from the siege, to undermine the siege, if you like, Prince Rupert's army staged a diversionary attack on the town of Leicester, the city of Leicester, which was a Puritan stronghold, a parliamentary stronghold. And breaching its walls and overcoming there was determined resistance from the defenders of Leicester, they entered the town and they took their revenge with sword and fire, inflicting the most terrible atrocities against the inhabitants. The result was a terrible slaughter of civilians. The bodies of women and children were found amongst the dead. It was an appalling atrocity, typical of the wonderful, glorious Cavalier forces. But at this point, you see the fall of Leicester again. It was a victory for the Royalists, and everything seemed to be going okay for the king. Seemed to be. They had stormed Leicester. The blockade of Chester had been lifted, and the eastern counties now was being threatened. Cromwell's heartland was being threatened. To make things even worse, from bad to worse, the Royalist forces in Scotland had won a victory, a signal victory over the army of Covenanters at Oberderne and Alford. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. It's a little bit, it's close to Aberdeen anyway. Everything seemed to be going fine for Charles, and yet things were about to undergo a fundamental change, a dramatic change, at the Battle of Naseby. Some days after the massacre at Leicester, the New Model Army gathered its troops and set out to attack the king's army in a small village in the centre of England, close to Daventry. The name of that village was Naseby, hardly a dot on the map, incidentally. And the Battle of Naseby, the most decisive battle of the war, took place in June 1645. I think Prince Rupert, typical of the man, was emboldened by the victory at Leicester. He was puffed up with his usual insuperable arrogance, and urged the Royalists to join battle with the New Model Army, under Fairfax it was actually. Swayed by its arguments, the Royalist forces agreed to advance. And as usual at Naseby, Rupert got up to his usual tricks. As usual, Rupert staged a dashing cavalry charge. He broke the enemy's lines, as he usually succeeded in doing that. And also, as usual, his men threw himself into the pursuit of the defeated enemy, as I say, as if it were a fox hunt. A bit of fun, you know. Yes, but this was no fox hunt. This was no fox hunt. The enemy forces facing Rupert were not the same men that fought at Edgehill, but they were Cromwell's Ironsides. The Ironsides threw themselves against the Royalist left flank, where, but in a single charge, they smashed through the northern horse under the Earl of Langsdale. And having succeeded in this attack, Cromwell did not repeat the fatal mistake of Prince Rupert. He pursued the fleeing enemy for about a quarter of a mile, and then he broke off the chase, let them go. And sending a few troops to prevent them from rallying and returning to the battle, he then wheeled round. These cavalrymen were very disciplined and very able to maneuver at a short notice. He wheeled them round and attacked the flank of the Royalist infantry, causing panic to break out in the King's Reserve, which fled the field, causing even more panic in the Royalist ranks. Rupert, as was his habit, he returned late with his forces, exhausted already by their pursuit. Yes, too late. Too late. In vain, a desperate Charles called out to his cavalry in a note of despair, "One charge more, and we recover the day." But there was to be no more charges. The Battle of Naseby was over. It is true that the losses sustained by the parliamentary army were greater than those of the royalists. 1,000 men were lost, as against less than 800 royalists. Yes, but 5,000 of the king's men surrendered, including 500 key officers. The king had lost all his artillery and ammunition, and his infantry was scattered to the four winds. The Battle of Newbury had torn the guts out of Charles's army, and his cause was in ruins. Charles was now in an impossible position, and reluctant to take the step of handing himself over to Parliament. He was afraid of being subjected to the insults and the ridicule of the parliamentary troops. He took a decision which was quite surprising at the time. He decided to hand himself over to the Scots, to the Scottish army. Now, the Scots, he'd been informed by his agents, stood for moderation. They tried to put the brakes on the radicals and the revolutionary elements in Parliament and so on. And therefore, being a very devious and manipulative, Machiavellian type as he was, he began to consider, the idea began to form in his brain of the intriguing prospect of playing off one faction against another in the process of regaining power for himself. Yes, he would throw in his lot with the Scots as the lesser evil, but in reality, of course, he didn't have much of an alternative. So in May, he turned up in the camp of the Scots. Now you can just imagine, just use your imagination. Just imagine the surprise of the Scottish generals and commissioners when the King Charles, suddenly appears in their midst. Of course, they must have been absolutely astonished. And although they paid him all the respect due to his royal dignity, they nevertheless took care to place him under guard, allegedly for his own protection, but in reality to stop him from escaping. Because this royal guest, they supposedly treated him as such, was in fact a valuable trading commodity. Now, Charles continued his intrigue. He never stopped intriguing this man. It's astonishing, his capacity to intrigue. He continued to try to play off the Scots against the English and the army against the Parliament and so on and so forth. Because in the end, the plans came to nothing, mainly on the religious question. Also because he refused, the Scots were adamant on this, that they must take action against his main supporters because of the crimes that they committed during the Civil War. He refused adamantly to do this. So in the end, his plans came to nothing, and the Scots finally decided that they should hand him over to the English Parliament. Of course, they weren't going to do this for nothing. Oh, no. They argued and they squabbled like people arguing over the price of a horse in the middle of gypsies arguing over the price of a horse in the middle of the town square, in the middle of the market. And finally, they convinced the English Parliament to hand over the sum of £400,000. That's an immense sum of money in those days. However, when Charles heard the figure, he joked that they'd sold their king on the cheap, but sold he was like a sack of potatoes. Yes, but despite the collapse, this is quite astonishing. Despite the collapse in his fortune, Charles continued to intrigue and maneuver in an attempt to play off the army against the Parliament. And in point of fact, he achieved some success in this. His real intentions, he didn't intend to support either the army or the Parliament. He actually confessed, he stated his interests as follows. I am not without hope. It's astonishing that a man without an army, without resources, without money, should be without hope. But he stated that. I am not without hope that I shall be able to draw either the Presbyterians or the Independents. Cromwell was an independent, to side with me for extirpating one another, so that I shall be really king again. So he was going to put them at each other's throats until they destroyed each other. Then he'd come back to power. That was his plan. Now, here's a very interesting and important point. The defeat of the king opens the door to the second phase, which turned out to be an intermediate phase between two civil wars, because there were two civil wars, as we shall see. But at this point, I referred earlier to dual power. Earlier on, the dual power expresses itself as the dual power between Parliament in London and the king in Oxford. That's clear. Now this changes to power. Charles has been defeated. He's off the chessboard, if you like. And therefore, dual power still exists. There's a new dual power. That's very important. You should grasp this. A new dual power now exists. A shift. Now the two centres are the Parliament and Cromwell's new model army, the new model army. And here you can find a very precise analogy with the Russian Revolution. In the February Revolution, you'll remember the mass of workers and peasants and soldiers overthrew the Tsar through their own forces. But formal power remained with the bourgeois provisional government, which was striving to do a deal with the monarchy. Bear that in mind. The Soviets, which were an alternative power representing the workers and peasants, were prevented by their leaders from going any further. And out of this contradiction arose what Lenin called the abortion of dual power. Now, here we find a precise analogy. The role of the Soviets in the English Revolution, I repeat once more, was fulfilled by the new model army. The rank and file soldiers were extremely radical. They wanted to push the revolution further. But the officers of the army, including Cromwell, had one foot in Parliament and the other in the army. And they tried to steer a middle course, like the Soviet leaders tried to steer a middle course, and held the army back. In this way, the initiative passed from revolution to counter-revolution in the form of a Presbyterian coup staged by the moderates in Parliament, which again led to a further radicalization of the revolution within the ranks of the new model army, about which we will speak next time.